welcome. This is wonderful to see such a huge crowd. I'm going to do the introductions. Before I do that, I've been asked to please, you can silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. I want to welcome you to the Jones Memorial Library, your library for local history and genealogy. My name is Jerry Shireko. I'm the Vice President of the JML Board. I also teach history over at Randolph College. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to say a few things about the Seth Woodruff Ledger book and its impact for one of my students and beyond. That ledger book, one of the few ever found that included both the first and last names of the enslaved, has been part of the Jones collection for quite some time. However, it was only recently rediscovered by Deb Smith, the then recently hired director of the Jones Memorial Library. This is an invaluable resource, but as in the case of many primary documents, it needed to be processed in order to be useful and accessible to researchers. Last year, a Randolph College student, now alum, Garrett Reynolds, who's here with his family, transcribed the ledger book, an arduous task that included deciphering Woodruff's early 19th century handwriting and writing style. Garrett then scanned the images of the pages, which had to be handled with extreme care due to the ledger book's age and fragility. How old and how fragile probably will come up by the speakers. In addition to providing a student with an invaluable internship experience, and that's what any of you who know college students or work at college or university, this is a wonderful place to get that kind of internship experience if one is interested at all in history and archival work, particularly local, but anything you learn here can be used for anything else as far as that. But in addition to that internship experience, three of us, Deb Smith, again the director, Lisa Broman, the director of the Lipscomb Library at Randolph, I tagged along. We were one of 7 teams throughout the country chosen to participate in a 1-week training at Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center as part of the Legacies of Slavery Institute. At the Institute, we shared details of the manuscript project and solicited feedback from 30 faculty and community partners on best practices providing, and this is a line I stole from Deb, transcription, description, and historical context. And beyond that, we made connections and got Lynchburg's history and the Jones Memorial Library's collection out there to a very wide audience. If you're at a place where David Blight, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his most recent book on Frederick Douglass, says, "You have what? You have a ledger book with first and last names of the enslaved?" If you're impressing someone like that, you're in a good place. With all that, I'm going to get off the stage after I introduce the speakers. Noelle Beverly is a museum experience leader at the Lynchburg Museum. Since November 2022, she has been researching Woodruff's slave auction and boarding business, which operated in the corner of Commerce and 10th Streets in downtown Lynchburg. You were driven by there hundreds of times. Noelle holds an MFA in creative writing and has worked as a creative and professional writer for over 20 years. Ted Delaney, director of the Lynchburg Museum System and chief public history officer for the city of Lynchburg. The museum system is responsible for operating the Lynchburg Museum, the old courthouse, and the Point of Honor historic site on Daniels Hill. Delaney is a graduate of the University of Virginia and was the executive director of the Old City Cemetery. He has written, consulted, and lectured about public history and genealogy for over 20 years. Deborah Smith, again, the executive director of the Jones Memorial Library, specializing in genealogy and history, and of course here in Lynchburg, where it has a collection that, at least in some parts, the Library of Virginia is envious of. We have a fantastic collection here in so many ways. If you haven't come here to find out what we have, please do. Now, prior to joining the Jones, Deb served as the executive director of the Essex Library Association in Essex, Connecticut. She holds an MLIS degree from Kent State University and has published on topics related to archival representation. Please join me in welcoming Noelle, Ted, and Deb to the podium.
Jerry, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Do I need to adjust microphone? Okay, thank you. Thank you. It is great to be here. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, to see so many friends, especially about this topic. This is just really heartening to see, and I'm so glad that you all are here. Thank you, Jerry, for that introduction, and also I want to thank Deb Smith for conceiving of this panel, for having the idea to do it, and for inviting me and Noel to be here. So thank you, Deb. This has been a great partnership between the museum and the library. All right, so I'm going to get started here, and hopefully all the technology will work. There we go. Okay, so as someone who grew up in Lynchburg and has spent most of my life living here, I must admit, until a few years ago, I had no real awareness of the slave trade in Lynchburg. I knew Lynchburg was home to enslaved people, and much of the antebellum economy here was based on enslaved labor, but I had never given much thought to the business of buying, selling, bartering, and auctioning of enslaved men, women, and children that happened here in our city every single day before 1865. The best illustration of this to me was this intersection that you see right here in 9th and Main Street, which until just a few years ago held no special connection to me with the institution of slavery. I knew this as the intersection of the town's most important axes, Main Street and 9th Street, and it was also the so-called point of beginning from which all of the lots of the original 45-acre town were surveyed and laid out in 1786. However, the intersection took on new meaning as we have discovered just in the past few months and years how often enslaved people were sold in this very spot right here in the heart of our city. The city's old market house, pictured here, this old postcard, stood literally in the middle of 9th Street. You can see the alley on the left running around it in 9th Street. There's a similar alley on the right side of the building. The front doors opened onto Main Street, and there was the site of regular auctions of enslaved people in antebellum Lynchburg. The photograph here, postcard actually based on a photograph, shows you the market house better in the middle of the street. Here's the market house from behind, like from up on where Monument Terrace is now, and you see 9th Street wrapping around either side. So the front doors you saw are on the other side of this building. The front doors, in front of the front doors of the market house, became the customary site for court-ordered public commissioners and trustees sales of real estate and personal property of all kinds. And in antebellum Lynchburg, that included men, women, and children of all ages. The intersection was Lynchburg's de facto public square before the Civil War, and sellers and auctioneers could be guaranteed a good crowd amid the bustle of daily commerce in this spot. Our recent discoveries about the market house and the slave trade in Lynchburg are a direct result of the Silent Witnesses Initiative, which began in 2021. Silent Witnesses is a collaborative public history project led by the Legacy Museum of African American History and the Lynchburg Museum System. The mission of Silent Witnesses is to document the enslaved experience of people of African descent and the related sites in Lynchburg, Virginia, and to educate citizens of all ages about this history. This is the website that you see here, silentwitnesses.org, and I encourage everybody to visit that. We also have brochures up on the table here that have the website and some more information, so please help yourself to those later. Auctions and sales at the market house are symbolic of slavery being at the heart of the local economy and daily life in antebellum Lynchburg, and also signaling the end of Quaker abolitionism that predominated in central Virginia from the 1770s through the very early 1800s. Especially during the 40 years before the Civil War, roughly beginning in about 1820, slavery expanded rapidly in Lynchburg and became central to the local economy and culture. Enslaved African Americans came to define what Lynchburg was by the 1830s. Nearly half of the city's population was enslaved, and in fact, there were more enslaved people per capita in Lynchburg than any other large town or city in the Commonwealth in the late antebellum period. And this chart here shows you the numbers don't matter so much as the orange line. So the orange line is where Lynchburg is if you rank the largest cities in Virginia in population order. And you see Lynchburg falls either at 6 or 7 every year, 1840, 50, 60. But if you sort that chart by percentage of enslaved people of the total population, this is what the charts look like. So Lynchburg is number 1 every single census year, 1840, 50, 60, the largest per capita in the state of Virginia. Out-of-town visitors and travel writers frequently commented on the presence of African Americans in the Hill City, literally from the moment they disembarked from canal boats, railroad cars, or stagecoaches. Enslaved people could be seen everywhere and at all times in Lynchburg. One quick note, slavery in Lynchburg did not look like this. This is the stereotype of agricultural plantation slavery. But slavery in Lynchburg rather looked like this. It was industrial, it was urban, it was very different. And that's part of the mission of Silent Witnesses is to uncover this. Just as one example, nearly half of all enslaved people in Lynchburg, which by extension is a quarter of the total population of the city, worked in the city's total 45 tobacco factories and stemmeries in the year 1860. Enslaved and free black laborers of all ages worked in unsavory conditions to process raw tobacco leaves and manufacture plugs of chewing tobacco, bringing great wealth and fame to the Hill City. I think it's also important for us to remember as we talk about this that for many African Americans before 1865, Lynchburg, just like places like Richmond and Charleston and New Orleans, meant slave auctions and sales. For many, the city was associated not just with slavery, but more specifically with the trauma of separating families and breaking up communities. Despite the dependence of local industries and businesses on enslaved labor, Lynchburg also became a significant hub in the vast network of the domestic slave trade, in which enslaved people came and went through Lynchburg to and from far-off places. Richmond, Virginia was the largest slave market in the Upper South, second only to New Orleans in the entire country. And because Lynchburg was so closely connected to Richmond by river, canal, road, and rail, the Hill City developed a thriving slave trade and became the largest slave market in Virginia west of Richmond. The United States banned the importation of slaves from other countries and territories in the year 1808. From that point forward, the domestic slave trade took on new importance, and over the course of the antebellum period, nearly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South, from places like Virginia and Lynchburg, to work on cotton plantations in the Deep South and other labor-intensive agriculture on the nation's western frontier. The map here illustrates the domestic slave trade, and the details aren't so important, the charts, but if you notice the direction of all the arrows, they are all pointing to the south and to the west. And so this is Lynchburg's role in this larger system, is helping to move people from the upper northeast south to the southwest. Because Virginia had the largest slave population in the entire nation, almost 500,000 in 1860, the demand for enslaved laborers in Virginia, and by extension therefore Lynchburg, was very intense. Buyers and dealers wanted to be where the slaves were, and that was in the Upper South in places like Lynchburg and Virginia. This advertisement from Lynchburg newspaper in 1846 mentions the fact that there was a dealer here advertising specifically for, do you see that, for the New Orleans, so he's advertising for the New Orleans market. This man was not in Lynchburg very long, don't know much about him, but this is from the Lynchburg newspaper, specifically indicating that he's looking for enslaved people to take to the farther Deep South. It's also worth noting that advertisements for sales and auctions, or wanted ads for buyers seeking slaves, are found in almost every single Lynchburg newspaper from 1790 to 1865. Once you start looking, they are everywhere, and it doesn't take you long to find a reference to a sale in any newspaper from this period. This is just a sampling of 6 different ads taken from different decades, but again, this is a very a small sample of many thousands of ads that appeared every year. In Lynchburg, the sale of enslaved people happened all over town, literally every place in town. They happen in public squares, and just as one example, this is Lynchburg about the time of the Civil War, so you see the James River down here. This is 9th Street coming through downtown, terminating up at what's now Monument Terrace at the courthouse. This is Main Street crossing right here. So the market house that we talked about earlier, that's this structure right here in the middle of 9th, and the square in front of it was, as we talked about, a popular auction spot. Sales took place on sidewalks in front of taverns and hotels on Main Street. All of the green dots here, there's the Franklin Hotel, Cabell House, Indian Queen Tavern. These are hotels on Main Street. Sales took place in front yards of homes or vacant lots that were being sold. They also took place in auction houses like those at Bryan Acres and Charles Phelps. And so some of the orange dots you see these are auction houses that were on Main Street, but you see everything is pretty much clustered on Main near 9th Street. A few businesses, like that of Seth Woodruff and James Hargrove, even had offices or facilities dedicated specifically to the buying, selling, housing, and housing of enslaved people. And here's an ad that I love. Somebody who is taking full advantage of gold rush fever in California. Do you see the headline right here? California Gold has nothing to do with his business. He just wanted to get your attention in the newspaper so that you would go on to read that he's looking for, as he says, young Negroes of both sexes. And he's got his description here. Extra note, he wants 2 good carpenters. And again, this is so typical of what you'll find in the newspaper at this time. Hotels, taverns, and inns made logical places to conduct sales in early Lynchburg before there were auction houses or dedicated slave trading businesses. People gravitated towards the food, the alcohol, and the gaming offered in hotels and taverns. And these places also accommodated buyers who traveled from the countryside or from out of town to attend the sales. Here is an example of an ad from the 1820s that mentions that this sale will take place before the door of the Franklin Hotel. And if we go back to the map, this is the Franklin Hotel. It's on the corner of 11th and Main. I want to point out that the slave trade in Lynchburg encompassed more than outright buying and selling of enslaved people. Many trading and brokering businesses catered to the extensive practice of hiring enslaved laborers or renting enslaved laborers. And in fact, historian Stephen Tripp has estimated that 40% of all white households in Lynchburg in the year 1860 either owned or rented at least one enslaved person, even though the actual number of those who owned slaves was much smaller. The prevailing custom was to hire out on an annual basis from January to December for a specified amount of money. Renters were expected to clothe, feed, and house enslaved laborers while in their care. I want to point out this one ad. This is from James Hargrove from the 1860s. And note his note here at the bottom, particular attention paid to hiring. So Hargrove was somebody who you could go to if you did not want to purchase a slave, but just wanted to rent one for the year or for some time. As Lynchburg grew as a town and center of regional commerce between 1800 and the Civil War, so did its slave trade. In the early decades of the 19th century, sales and auctions in Lynchburg were relatively infrequent, and usually private sales. These are private sales conducted by individual owners. Here are 2 examples from the 18 teens. One that just tells readers to inquire of the printer. So you would just literally go to the newspaper printer. He would tell you who it was that was offering this person. This is probably Samuel Garland, telling you that he is looking for 2 or 3 able-bodied men for hiring in the ensuing year, also a waterman for sale on reasonable terms. But again, it's just one-on-one, you go directly to the owner. As time passed, auction houses and commission merchants began adding enslaved people to their business, offering to sell men, women, and children alongside furniture, livestock, and all manner of personal property. Here's an advertisement from an auction house owned by John Payne, and I wanted to point out the juxtaposition here. He's telling you that he's got valuable Negroes for sale here, and then the day before he's selling cabinet furniture. Same person, same business, and that was typical that an auction house like today would sell all manner of personal property. By the 1840s, local men began going into the business of exclusively brokering and trading enslaved people, with no interest in selling horses or wagons or tables or cabinet furniture, that sort of thing. This business card from James Hargrove, the man that we saw earlier from 1863, shows that his business doesn't mention anything else here. It's an auction house and commission merchant, but it is specifically for the sale of Negroes publicly and privately. And in general, we see over this period, there is a clear progression from individual private sales to these auction houses and commission merchants, then to more sophisticated professional slave dealers like Hargrove. The most prolific and widely known of this last category was a man named Seth Woodruff. And I am going to now turn the podium over to my colleague Noelle Beverly, who is going to tell you more about this fascinating man, Seth Woodruff, and his business here in Lynchburg. Noelle?
I also want to say thank you to Ted and Deb for having me here. As Ted was telling you, during the mid-1800s, Seth Woodruff operated an extensive slave auction and boarding business on the corner of 10th and Commerce, or Lynch Street. You may have walked right by that corner, as Jerry said, many times and not realized what had been there before. This is what it looks like now. It's a parking structure. It's pretty brightly painted. This is an image from 1881. And so this is what it looked like in Woodruff's time as well. And here now we have highlighted the residence of Seth Woodruff. And his business operated behind that residence. There's a lot we don't know about Seth Woodruff, but I'll tell you what I do know. Woodruff was born circa 1805 in Amherst County to Jesse and Rhoda Pettijohn Woodruff. While he was still an infant, his mother, Rhoda, died. His father remarried and had other children, but Seth joined his mother's family in Amherst County at this time. Woodruff was raised by his grandfather, William Pettijohn. He grew up and was educated alongside first cousins as if they were siblings. In 1822, when Woodruff was about 17, his grandfather died. And in his will, after providing for his widow, William Pettijohn instructed that his estate be divided into 7 equal shares. 6 of those went to his 6 living children. The 7th share, which would have gone to Rhoda, he bequeathed to Seth Woodruff. And Seth was able to claim that inheritance when he turned 21. The Pettijohn estate was substantial. It consisted of land, money, personal property, and slaves. Once he was of age, Woodruff received between 11 and 13 of these slaves, as well as a sum of money. Of the enslaved individuals that Woodruff inherited, we know only a few by name. Several women, including Dinah and Patience, and 2 different women named Betty. But he also inherited several men, including Isham, Aravan, Pompey, and Moses, who was a blacksmith by trade. Without this inheritance, it's unlikely that Seth Woodruff could have established a large-scale business so quickly. He sold several of the inherited slaves to owners in Virginia and further south where he could fetch a higher price. He also used Moses to open a blacksmith shop in Amherst County. We don't know how long that blacksmith shop was in operation, but eventually Woodruff sold Moses too for a significant amount of money, after which he shifted his business from Amherst to Lynchburg. According to Woodruff's first cousin, William Ridgway, the money that Seth Woodruff had received from both his grandfather's estate and the sale of the inherited slaves gave him a cash capital of between $11,000 and $12,000. Ridgway also claimed that Woodruff himself confirmed that this capital enabled him to go into the trade of buying and selling slaves. Woodruff lost little time setting up his business. In the late 1820s, while he was barely 21 or 22 years old, records show that he was already well-versed on the particulars of the slave trade. Woodruff may have found a mentor and a patron in a man named Captain John Taylor, a slave trader based in Amherst County. In a letter to Taylor dated April 1828, Woodruff demonstrated his understanding of the local economy. "Everything is selling very low," he wrote. Tobacco is worth nothing at all at this time. Corn is worth $2 per barrel. Negroes, none selling at this time. By the 1830s, the slave trading business had picked up and Woodruff was ready to buy. He placed an ad in 1830 stating, "The subscriber wishes to purchase from 70 to 80 likely young Negroes of good character, chiefly young men, for which the highest cash prices will be given." Woodruff negotiated these early sales at the Washington Hotel on Church Street in downtown Lynchburg. After a successful decade and a half, Woodruff established a permanent site for his business here. In 1846, he purchased what was known as Lot 10, the corner lot on Lynch and 10th. From this Sanborn fire insurance map, dated 1885, we have a few more details about the layout of this business. So here we have Lynch Street, and here's 10th, and this is the Lot 10 that we're talking about. So this structure here was Woodruff's residence, and his business would have been conducted behind. So some of these structures are wooden, some brick. This would have been for boarding slaves, and the open space would have been where some of the auction and sales took place. Ads placed in the Lynchburg newspapers in the 1850s reveal that Woodruff's business here had expanded in several ways. From this, we see he was willing to purchase slaves of both genders, but he had a particular interest in acquiring skilled individuals, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and coopers, for which he offered to pay the highest market price in cash, and he would also get more money for these individuals. Woodruff also advertised his new offices, expressly built for boarding slaves, promising he would keep them as secure as if they were placed in the jail of the corporation. And from this time on, his business was known as Woodruff's Jail. In 1853, Woodruff's role as a Lynchburg slave broker was documented for international audiences when Harriet Beecher Stowe referenced him in one of her best-selling books, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was a follow-up work to her famous anti-slavery novel, and it was written in response to her detractors, many of whom were Southern critics, who accused her of misrepresenting slavery. In A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, the author compiled examples, including extracts from Southern newspapers, that verified her research. Stowe directly quoted Woodruff's recurring advertisement that we just saw on these pages here to show that slave traders routinely broke families apart. In sentences aimed at both Woodruff and her Southern critics, Stowe wrote, "Don't curse poor Mr. Seth Woodruff because he does the horrible, loathsome business of tearing up the living human heart. It's disagreeable business enough, and if you must have him do it for you, treat him civilly and don't pretend that you are any better than he." We don't really know how many hundreds of men, women, and children were traded through Woodruff's business during its years of operation, but numerous letters, receipts, personal accounts prove that individuals were traded both locally, but also transported to Richmond, where they were sold, chained together in coffles, and moved further south to Kentucky, Texas, and Louisiana. In this image, we see a letter from Seth Woodruff written to a man named R.H. Dickinson of Dickinson Hill and Company. He was based in Richmond, one of the largest slave trading businesses in Richmond. And this letter, it gives you an idea of Woodruff's handwriting, for one thing, but it negotiates the transport and potential sale of 3 young boys. Woodruff and Dickinson had regular business dealings and they corresponded frequently. Harriet Beecher Stowe's assessment that Woodruff's business split families apart was directly confirmed by members of the enslaved community. This is Martha Penn Taylor, and this photo was taken in 1880, but nearly 30 years before this, 1853, she wrote to Sweetbriar plantation owner Elijah Fletcher, "I am now in the hands of Mr. Woodruff, and I expect to start very soon to the south if you will not oblige me as to buy me." Elijah Fletcher owned Martha's sister Mary, and at great risk to herself, Martha asked Fletcher to purchase her too so that she could stay close to her family. Throughout the 1850s, Woodruff's business continued to thrive. Census records from 1860 show that his total assets, real estate, and personal property were worth above $100,000. During this time, Woodruff also enjoyed political standing in Lynchburg. In 1858, he joined the city council and served in that capacity for the next 8 years. At the approach of the Civil War, however, slave traders all over the South, including Woodruff, were finding it difficult to continue business. By 1861, he was struggling to find buyers, but he was also suffering from poor health as well. And his slave trading business declined sharply at this time. In response, he quickly adapted. He established a new business, Woodruff and Spence, a bank located on Main Street, and he partnered with a man named William Q. Spence for that endeavor. After the Civil War, Woodruff was granted a presidential pardon for his role in Lynchburg's slave trade, and he maintained his status as a well-regarded citizen of the city. In 1872, he purchased Point of Honor on Daniel Hill, and he rented the house out, but he used one of the accompanying islands in the James River for his own farming endeavors, and it's still known as Woodruff's Island. When Woodruff died in 1875, he left behind substantial material assets, but little in the form of a personal legacy. He had never married, and he had no officially recognized offspring. His bank, Woodruff and Spence, was dissolved not long after he died. And just a few years into the 20th century, the slave trading business to which he had devoted decades of his life had largely faded from the official collective memory. Seth Woodruff's legacy as a slave broker was remembered, however, by those directly affected by his business. In 1897, a woman named Rose King Caudle named Woodruff as the trader who separated her from her family and sold her to slave owners in Kentucky. Rose and her mother Charlotte, as well as her brothers, Alfred, John, Reason, Robert, and Paul King, are among those who passed through Woodruff's hands. And here we see Charlie Mitchell, a former slave born in Lynchburg who shared his narrative with the Federal Writers Project decades later in 1937. Mitchell also remembered Woodruff, and he remembered that his trading yard was the largest operation in the city, where slaves were handcuffed and chained together and led off like convicts. It's for the sake of these individuals, as well as their descendants, that we continue to investigate these difficult histories. With that thought in mind, I want to turn things over now to Deb Smith so that she can share even more details from her recent findings.
I'm going to try and walk and talk a little bit here, just so everybody, maybe a little breath in and a little breath out. So it can be a lot, is what I'll just say. So I'm going to talk about manuscript 1047, which is the Seth Woodruff account book. And I invite you after the talk, we actually have it right up here on this table. We don't usually make it available because it's in fragile condition, but we have it in a box so you're able to see the original. When you come to visit the library, you can see we have 2 transcribed copies. Those are also on the table, but most importantly, we have it in digital format. So even if you're not in Lynchburg or you want to see it not at the library, we have it now all online. And that's the project I'm going to talk to you about now. So what you're seeing here is actually, this is a page from the book. You can see this is Seth Woodruff's handwriting. And it's Lynchburg, October 16th, 1835 on this page. What he did in the book was he actually used a format where he had basically the prices that he paid for enslaved persons and then the prices and whom he sold people to. So that's the way this book is constructed. So manuscript 1047, it is a rather unassuming book. It is a tan leather book, and on the cover it has SW number 2. We don't know where SW number 1 or if there's an SW number 3, but we have SW number 2. He wrote in black ink, in cursive handwriting. His handwriting is very difficult to decipher. He was not the best at penmanship and not very good at spelling either. It is 74 pages inside this book. However, there are only 28 pages which actually have information on them. So most of the book is blank. There are entries between 1834 and 1840, so it covers a 6-year period. And this manuscript came to us as a gift to the library from the Manson family. Just a little bit about who's in the book. So we have 206 people named in the book. Of those, 36 are children. We have 135 named sold persons. We have 33 unnamed relocated persons. So that 135 plus those 33 were all enslaved persons. We also have 36 named buyers, and we have 2 named traders. So when we say traders, these were not people who were purchasing enslaved persons, but they were providing goods or services that enabled the slave trade. In terms of the names, there are 169 people listed with both the first and the last name in the account book. There are 4 children where we have an inferred surname, right? So we know it's child of so-and-so, and we can assume it's the child has the last name, perhaps, of the parents. There are 33 people who are not named in the book, but when we did our data set, we did not enter them as a lump 33. We actually put people as this is the first person, second person, third person, fourth person. So we don't know who they were, but we know that they were unnamed and they were mentioned in the book. In terms of places, it's mostly Lynchburg, but as Ted and Noel were saying earlier, this book is actually evidence of that slave trade to the Deep South. So we also have Natchez, Mississippi, and we have New Orleans, Louisiana. So in terms of the significance of this book, it is highly significant historically. So first is that we have first and last names included. So it is a myth that you didn't have last names of the enslaved because we have them here. Now that is not to say that those surnames, those last names, were not the names of people who were owners, okay? But it does at least give you some chain as to where the person might have been physically located prior. Okay? So in terms of the historical evidence, as Ted was saying earlier, in 1808, Congress had banned the transatlantic slave trade because England had outlawed it. And so between 1808 and 1865, you had what's called the Second Middle Passage. So the first Middle Passage was going across the Atlantic to the United States. The Second Middle Passage occurs within the United States, and that's a transfer, the forcible transfer of people basically from the Upper South to the Deep South. And that's because you have rice farming, cotton farming, all that sort of labor-intensive industry in the Deep South. And so since the Deep South plantations can no longer import people, enslaved people from Africa, it's all being supplied then from the Upper South to the Lower South. So this journal is significant because it is within this period for the Second Middle Passage and is documenting that. Between 1834 and 1835, in this book, we know there are at least 50 enslaved persons who were moved by Woodruff from Lynchburg to Natchez and New Orleans. We were talking earlier about the fact that you have families who are separated. What is really interesting in the account book is that we have at least 21 possible family units. So we have repeated surnames within the book. So you can see here, we've got Ambler, Burford, Coleman, Crow, Davis, Day, Drew, Elliott, Hap or Hop, Hunter, Jordan, Matthews, Monday, Mosley, Paxton, Radford, Reynolds, Ridgway, Shanks, Terry, and Wilson. So those are all repeated surnames where we have what we think are either brothers and sisters, mothers, fathers, children, sort of a combination of people who are sharing a surname and often are being traded on the same page within the ledger. I'm just going to go back for a second here. So in addition to people's names, there are also notes. So what you see here is this is actually a page of the book where it says, expenses on 33 Negroes from Lynchburg, Virginia to Natchez, Mississippi from 17 January to 18th of February so his expenses, $340.75. Okay, so he's keeping notes of his account. So I found this book, I joined the library in 2022, and as part of getting familiar with our collections, I actually went through and looked at what's in the boxes in the back. And so I found this fairly early as I was going through the collection, and I realized this is a significant item in our collection, and we need to determine what our next steps are to make this information available. So pretty quickly, I tapped into a brain trust of people who helped us determine what our project's goals and outcomes could be from working with this book. So we knew we wanted to do something that was mission congruent, and this is very mission congruent to us because it contains the names of people. And we're a genealogy library. So being able to share the names of people with potential descendants, people who are researching, it's all mission congruent for us. So that was a good fit. We wanted to increase discoverability. So it's sitting in the back there. Nobody really knows it's there. How do we let people know this important information about people so that descendants could do research, so that scholars could do research? We also knew that we wanted to engage volunteers and interns. So one of our strategic goals is to have more research engagement. So this was a project that seemed that it could fit very well with that. We also wanted to promote scholarly use of our resources. In terms of the book itself, we wanted to provide long-term access. And that meant digitization and data extraction and publication, because we know we have a resource here which is it's written, it's handwritten, it's on paper, it's going to deteriorate over time. So we knew we had to do sort of an intervention if we're going to preserve that data long term for future generations. So we started to conceive of the project, and we actually had many project partners who helped us. And so I want to give a shout out to the Greater Lynchburg Community Foundation because they gave us grant funding to hire an intern. And I'm going to ask Garrett to stand up if he doesn't mind. Garrett? Garrett did great work for us, and he worked on this project transcribing. First, he took the images of the book so that we would have the digital pictures, and then he actually transcribed. So he got really familiar with Woodruff's handwriting, which I see he's rolling his eyes because it was so hard to determine what Woodruff was writing. That grant made it possible to buy what you're seeing there. Which Garrett's standing in front of a camera. It's an overhead camera, so we don't have to lay the book flat on a camera. We can actually take the image from above, which is important because this resource is in very delicate shape. The binding is pretty much gone, so we wanted to take it overhead, and that's Garrett there trying out the scanner. I think that's the first day we had it set up. And then the other partners that we worked with were, of course, Lynchburg Silent Witnesses, because we knew that there was interest in doing a marker for Woodruff's auction house and jail. We also, as Jerry mentioned earlier, we had we were chosen as a community partner on Randolph College's team with the Consortium of Independent Colleges to go to the CIC Legacies of Slavery Institute at Yale last summer. And that was just a marvelous opportunity to educate ourselves about what other projects are occurring around the country, and also to get feedback on what were sort of the advised next steps for handling this information, and what we could do, what were the best practices for handling this data. I'm going to give a little shout out here to From the Page. FromThePage.com is actually a crowdsourced transcription site. So Garrett, as great as he was at transcription, he couldn't do the whole thing, all himself. He actually did, I want to say 95% of it, and then we had other volunteers who checked the work. And then what we did was we actually put some of the pages on FromThePage.com from the Woodruff account book to see there are some tricky spellings of things, people's names we couldn't get quite, is the Greater Wisdom going to do a better job than Garrett? And actually they didn't. Garrett got it much better. And part of that, so part of the moral there is working with people who are local is really important because they recognize the place names, the people names. You think it's sort of like it's that knowledge which comes in, which you're not really conscious of, but which is there. And so Garrett could sort of ferret it out quicker than I would say, somebody who is maybe in California or overseas could. But From the Page is a great resource. So if you are an institution which needs to do transcription, I recommend looking at From the Page. The first 50 pages are free. And after that, they have subscriptions, but they are really great folks who are also looking at how we can use artificial intelligence to help solve some of the problems of transcribing these handwritten documents. And we also partnered with Enslaved.org and the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. We knew that we wanted this information not just to be held at Jones Memorial Library, but we wanted it to be available to researchers, descendants around the globe. So Enslaved.org they're mostly working with people who are academics. And so when I show you on the next slide, you're going to see the data set. One of the issues with doing this type of work is that it's very time intensive in terms of recording precisely who's listed where, and then making sure that you have unique IDs and so forth. So a lot of scholars would say, well, heck, it's going to take me a year to make a data set, and I could write an article in 4 months instead. So Enslaved.org is trying to incentivize people, scholars who have access to these documents and this information to do the work, because you can then be published in the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation in addition to having your data set. So it's sort of a win-win for scholars and also for the historical record in terms of making this information available long-term. They also partner with what's called the Harvard Dataverse. So it's one thing to spend a lot of time transcribing information, but you want to make sure that it's permanently available. And one of the reasons we partnered with Enslaved.org is because our data is now in the Harvard Dataverse, so it is permanently there. So even if we were to lose this resource, we would have the digital images, we'd have the data set all there in the Harvard Dataverse. We also were very fortunate to submit the Seth Woodruff account book as a top 10 endangered artifact, and it was chosen by the Virginia Association of Museums as a top 10 endangered artifact, which meant that we got some additional publicity for the project, and we will also get a small amount of funding for preservation purposes. So in terms of the data set itself, what we did was Garrett took digital images of the book, and then he went through and he said, okay, who's the first person named on this page? What's their name? I'm going to enter that into a spreadsheet. Who's the second person? And what's going on here? Is it a sale? Is it a transfer of people? What's the date involved? What's the amount of money involved? All of that. He's recording all of that into a spreadsheet. And so you can see an example here of the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet, which is with Harvard Dataverse, has 231 rows of information. It's got 28 fields. And what we did was we actually, because the writing was so bad, we weren't always sure if the spelling was correct that we had. So we gave actually an alternate first name field. We have an alternate surname field. And that's in those cases where we weren't exactly sure. But we wanted to make sure, well, heck, if somebody's looking for Larry, but we think it's Lori, let's give them all the options there. It increases the amount of, increases the certainty that you would get a match in terms of who you're looking for in your tree. So we also have amounts and dates, we have locations, and we have roles. So you could have a different role. So enslaved person is sort of the person's status, but as we were saying earlier, you could be a carpenter, you could be a cook, so also or you could be a driver. So we also have what's called sort of a role there. So as I said, the data set was published with enslaved.org. It's permanently available with the Harvard Dataverse. And then we also did an article about the methodology for how we created that data set, and that is published with the journal. So you can see here, here's the data set. That's what enslaved.org's website looks like. And then that's what the journal facing page looks like. So one of the questions I'm anticipating you might have is sort of how can you participate in a project like this? So one thing is to check your family tree, okay? Is there anyone who you think might have been enslaved? Is there anyone who might have been an enslaver? Is there anyone who might have been engaged in a trade with the slave trade? And by doing that, you can help to make the information available. A lot of people may feel that, oh, this is shameful information from the enslaver side, or it's information from the enslaved to descendant side that I really don't want, that was long ago, I really don't want to deal with that, it's too emotional, right? But one of the things to do is check your family tree, see if there's anybody there, because then you have a great amount of agency to make information available to next generations. Another thing you can do is if you have documents in your family, maybe in the attic, maybe in the basement, which are documents that relate to the slave trade, you can give those to a repository like Jones Memorial Library or the Lynchburg Museum. You can also volunteer to transcribe documents, and that can be here at the library, that can be online, all sorts of different ways to do that, and we will train you as well. And you can also volunteer to research people or places. So of those names of people, you know, we know all those hundreds of people's names, but we actually don't have a lot of information yet on, you know, what were their lives like? Who were their possible descendants? And Garrett had started that research before his internship ended, but there's still a lot. This project is, you know, it's hundreds of people, so there's a lot to discover. I also have up here some resources for you in case you're interested, and don't worry, we'll be posting the slides with the recording. So Silent Witnesses website, there's also Digital Jones, and that's where we actually keep our copy There's enslaved.org. And then I also recommend for Virginia generally, there's the Virginia Untold Project. And then there's also the 10 Million Names Project. So the 10 Million Names Project is started by a group called American Ancestors, which is the New England Historic and Genealogical Society up in Worcester, Massachusetts. And what they've estimated is that there were 10 million enslaved persons in North America. And so what they're trying to do is get the names of all 10 million collected. And very ambitious project, going to take a very long time, but wow. I want to tell you a little bit about our current project, and I think I saw Steve in the back there. I was just gonna, yeah, there's Steve in the back who's working, he's a volunteer working on our current project. And I also wanted to say, Peggy and Doug, if you could also stand up because you had also helped with the transcription. Yep, they're here in the front row. And they were hoping to look at Garrett's work and to Steve is doing that exact thing with a collection that we have now, which is called the Potter Papers. And the Potter Papers, we actually had an intern who worked remotely for us in the month of January on this project. So we have information about Lynchburg slave trade, but we also have papers in the collection about the slave trade in other areas. And the Potter Papers came to us through the grandson-in-law of John Potter, who was very highly successful in consolidating plantations along the Savannah River in Georgia. He made those into very large rice plantation tracts. One of those was the Coleraine Plantation and Tweenside Plantation, which were studied by the Georgia Historical Quarterly in a series of articles in the 1930s. These were enormous plantations. And we have the Potter Estate Papers. They came into Lynchburg, and we're here in Lynchburg in a lawyer's office for a number of years before we're donated to the library. So one of the projects we're doing now is transcribing those, and I believe it's 16 or 17 documents in there, which are inventories, wills, bills of sale, that kind of thing. But not every state is like Virginia, which has Virginia Untold. So Georgia does not have a Georgia Untold yet. So we really have this information here. And so we want to share those names with other researchers. Also given the fact that the Potter family they were living in South Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey, Virginia, sort of all over the place. So it's not just Lynchburg records that we have here at the Jones. And it's also not just Lynchburg records that you might consider donating to the Jones, because we care and are custodians for papers and collections for anybody who sort of has a connection with Lynchburg. So that is the current project that we're working on. We estimate there are at least 500 people to 1,000 people who are named in these papers, and some of them do have last names. First and last name, but many of them are first name only. So we have up here our contacts in case you want to get in touch with Noelle, Ted, or me. And then I'm just going to end on this last slide here with our acknowledgments to thank people who had contributed to the project here, and also to give you this, which is the QR code to the papers. So you can come up and see here the original book. You can also see our transcription. So what we did is we put it online, and if you go online, you can see the transcription there. But when you come into the library, you can also see it. So what you're seeing here is the original on the bottom, and then the transcription on the top, so that you can read the book sort of page by page here as well. But with that, I'm going to end, and we're going to see if anybody has any questions.
Could you give us some idea of how much a slave costs, say, an adult or a child, just from the record?
Okay, so the question was, how much did an enslaved person, what was the market value? And that actually, you can see, sorry. when you see the data set, you will see those figures because we have the bought for amount and the sold for amount in the data set. I just want to go back here just a second. So if you look here, and it might be a little hard to see it, but we have Esther Mosley, or Easter Mosley, was purchased for $480. And it's actually Esther Mosley and child. Okay. So this, we have a number of infants who were sold with the mother, and they have here who the purchaser was. You have here Esther Mosley and child. Actually, that was another sale here down on a different date. Esther Mosley and child were sold for $650. So he's making a profit here of, what is that, $170? Right, so you can see that this for Woodruff, it's a business, right? So one of the other things that's unique about this manuscript is you can track the economic gain that occurred from the trade, right? So this is how wealth was created, right? So you're purchasing and you're selling, and so you can see the purchase amount for these people was $8,580 for these 15 persons, and then here he's selling those 15 persons for $9,750. So he's tracking his costs and his profits. So, and you will see. So I invite you to look at the book and the transcription, because you can see that data right there. You can see the difference between young men, older women, people who had a child, right? And so if you think about that, America was unique because it had chattel slavery, okay? So nowhere else in the world were you enslaved and then your children were enslaved after that, right? It was generational slavery, right? So you can see that there would have been a higher value for a mother and child because, number one, the woman is fertile. Number two, that child is going to grow up and still be enslaved. So you can track that economics within this resource as well. In the back?
Given that enslaved people couldn't be imported after, 1808?
Mm-hmm.
What was Woodruff's source for his supply? When he advertised, wanted, where did he expect to get those people from? State sales, or what was the source?
Right, so people would trade and sell. So enslavers would say, okay, I don't need this many enslaved persons working in my household. I'm gonna go to Seth Woodruff because he's the middleman who can then trade this enslaved person, and I can get, or I need money, and so I need to pay off a debt, so I'm going to sell or transfer an enslaved person to pay off my debt. And we actually see a lot of that in the Potter papers, that other collection, where we see the way that John Potter got a lot of the enslaved people was his neighbors kind of went bankrupt because they were not in rice farming. They were trying to use the land for other purposes. So they went bankrupt. He buys up those estates, and what's happening is all those enslaved persons are being sold as part of the estate. So you actually see a lot of sheriff's sales, a lot of courthouse sales in that particular collection.
This is not so much a question as it is an observation, and I think I am correct about this, though I can't remember the citation. But if my memory is correct, just to show the economic importance of what was going on was the sale of slaves down south was the largest single source of revenue for the state of Virginia in the 50s and the 60s.
That might be in Ted. Do you want to?
Cham knows more about this than I do. Thank you, Cham. I had not heard that before, but it makes
I
sense.
think it was a C. Dan Woodward book, and I should have looked at it before I came here.
Yeah, I think it was the biggest export in 1860, more than tobacco,
Yeah.
slavery.
Yeah, and just remember, as I mentioned, Virginia had the largest enslaved population in the entire country. 500,000 people here, more than any other state. So it just stands to reason that it would drive the economy here too.
And the the state of Virginia, the number one export in 1930. It was as early as 1930.
Could you repeat that?
1830.
Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear.
Gwen, can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, just loud. In the state of Virginia, about 1830, the number one export out of the state was enslaved people.
In the 1830s, the number one export out from Virginia outbound were enslaved persons.
So why was slavery abolished in relation to slave trade coming in from Africa?
The United Kingdom, England, outlawed it.
It was also written into the Constitution. They couldn't set up, I used to work at James Marist Highland, so it was fine all this stuff. The Constitution also has that written in. They couldn't set up, the founding fathers were having a hard time building a whole new country, and also dealing with slavery, which was always a problem for them. So they kicked the can down the road.
Yeah, and you also had so I'm going to actually have Ted talk about this because you also had the rise of the abolitionist movement. So you had more pressure to stop the slave trade, but England was a very important part of that because the ships were going from England to Africa to the Jamaica, Barbados, and so forth, and to the United States. So that was sort of the whole triangle, right? And so when England cuts itself out of that, that changes part of the equation. But maybe Ted can.
But wasn't the price of a slave higher as a U.S. born or American slave compared to an African slave?
That I can't tell you. I don't know. And maybe John knows. John's in the back here. John Ontrell.
Virginia actually abolished the slave trade into Virginia in 1778, but the reason wasn't completely altruistic. It was that and of course, it was during the Revolutionary War, so in a way it was a moot point, but there had been pressure in Virginia to abolish the slave trade for a long time, but it was in planters' interest to end the African slave trade into Virginia, because that would mean that there were fewer slaves in Virginia, and therefore the prices would be higher. Whereas if you had a lot of slaves coming in from Africa, that would increase the supply and the prices would go down. So if you wanted to get into the business of selling slaves, you had higher prices if there was no African trade. The British did abolish the slave trade in 1807. In the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there was a compromise reached whereby the slave trade would continue into those states which still had it for at least 20 years. Congress was forbidden from interfering with the African slave trade for 20 years. And that was to make sure that South Carolina and Georgia were satisfied. They threatened to walk out of the convention if the slave trade were ended, because they still needed a lot more slaves. So 20 years later, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. In 1808, January 1st, the first thing Thomas Jefferson does, President Jefferson, on January 1st, is he signs the abolition of the African slave trade into the United States. But again, that's because the Constitution permitted it to last for 20 more years, thus satisfying South Carolina and Georgia. And in fact, Charleston, which has a marvelous museum now of slavery and the slave trade, Charleston, during that period, the 80s and 90s, was the leading importer of slaves in the United States. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, one more question? Yeah.
Well, you have to have a purchaser in this. Maybe I missed it, but is the name of the purchaser recorded anywhere?
In the account book, yes. So we have, as I said, we had something like 36 buyers. So actually on this you can see sold to John Allenson. And then here we have, this was the cost of a lot of Negroes sold to Rowan Harris. So Rowan and John Harris were became business partners of Woodruff. So there was also trading sort of between traders, if you will, right? Sales between traders. But here we have this person who I think is either Walter or Martha Huffman, was sold to John Allenson. So yes, we have the names of the buyers.
Were the slaves sold solely to individuals, or did, for lack of a better term, corporate entities, businesses could be registered as it were, of a slave owner, a slave?
So most of the trade that occurs in this book in Lynchburg was actually between individuals. It was individuals. So Seth Woodruff had purchased someone, and then he was selling to an individual, or he was making a group sale to one of those business partners who was then selling onward. Right? So in terms of the bulk sales, you know, what we have here is that group of 33 unnamed persons, right, who were moved, and that's how we have those. I said there were something like 50 unnamed people, and these are 33 of them, because we don't know exactly who are these 33 who were transported from Lynchburg to Natchez, Mississippi. But this is obviously, he's making a trip, right? Transporting people down to Mississippi, and that sort of is a group sale. Now, we don't know on the other end, and at the University of Mississippi, I believe it is, has a project which is trying to sort of triangulate who people in Mississippi were sold to. Right, so they have a big project that they're working on data-wise. So there's a little bit of interest from Mississippi about who these 33 might be. But that was a group. It could have been a group sale, or it could have been just what we did was we called it a transfer, because we know people are being relocated, but we don't know what happened on the other end. But in terms, can you speak, Ted, at all about sort of corporatization, buying?
So let me just add one detail to that. Corporations and businesses absolutely did purchase enslaved people and sell enslaved people. And the best place to find that maybe for Lynchburg is if you look at the 1860 slave schedules for Lynchburg. So this is the set of census records that accompany the population schedules. They will tell you who the employers and who the owners are of every single enslaved person in the city of Lynchburg. And just as one example, the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad owned enslaved people in Lynchburg and then employed them to build new railroad, lay new railroad through the state of Virginia. There are a lot of tobacco companies, tobacco factories here, well-known names of tobacco factories downtown that had not only hired enslaved people, but also owned them. So to answer your question, yes, and that 1860 slave schedule is a good place to see them.
Well, we're going to wrap it up. Feel free to come up and take a look at some of the resources that we have here. We have the Silent Witnesses brochure as well. I encourage you to check out that website. Thank you so much to Ted and Noel, and thank you to our volunteers and our interns, and thank you for coming.